Now, folks, in this life, we have dreams and visions, and we set goals, but for one reason or another, somehow or other, we kind of get off track, and we get frustrated, and either we give up or just simply put it on the back burner, and we wait maybe for another time, another place. So 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 11 and 12. And after him was Shammah, the son of Agee the Hararite, and the Philistines were gathered together into a troop where was a piece of ground full of lentils, and that's lentils, you know, or peas. A ground full of peas, and the people fled from the Philistines. But he stood in the middle of the ground, Shammah did, and defended it, and slew the Philistines, and the Lord wrought a great victory that day. Chapter 23 really is a story of David's mighty men, his mighty warriors. As a matter of fact, as we look at these men, they were always in some skirmish, fighting some battle, protecting David, going into battle with David. And I picked out one of these warriors in order to give you a snapshot of some principles that will help us to be successful in the day in which we're living. Every year, it seems, that the Israelites would plant their crops, and when it got harvest time, the Philistines would sweep down out of the hills and attack the Israelites as they were gathering the harvest and just rob them of their harvest, and there they were left without anything to eat. Now, I think about that, and I think about Shammah, and I think about all of these mighty warriors of David, and I think, these folks aren't really unlike you and me today. They really aren't. Doesn't matter if you're a doctor or a lawyer or an Indian chief or a career person or a common laborer. That doesn't matter. Your title, your vocation really is irrelevant because we all find ourselves down in the trenches day by day fighting against the Philistines of our day, of our world, of your world. Now, these Philistines may be our own emotions. We battle them. It could be family stress. We have that, don't we? It could be job stress. We have that. Some other malady, you name it. Call them what you will. They are our enemies today, fighting against us, taking advantage of us. And like the Israelites of old, we get to the point where we're just simply out of our wits, at the end of our rope. But I want to give you some encouragement this morning as we take a look at Shammah, the warrior that we read about just a few minutes ago in 23 of 2 Samuel, verse 11 and 12. The Philistines, they banded together against Israel. They took advantage of the Israelites. They were more in number. They were better equipped for war than the Israelites. And they came against them. The Israelites were outnumbered. Folks, we are going to be taken advantage of. And the odds are going to be stacked against us, not sometimes, but most of the time today. It could be that you're a lone voice at a committee meeting. It could be that you're at a school board meeting and you're the only one there you feel like that will stand against what's happening in today's world. You may be at a council meeting and you don't agree with what's going on and you're alone. You're the only voice in the crowd that will speak up and speak out. You may be in a group of friends and you're the lone voice. And it very well may seem that they're against you. And they probably are. We want to live peaceably, as Paul tells us, as best we can with all men. We don't want to offend anybody if we can possibly not offend anybody. But folks, I want to tell you something. There comes a time when we must stand up and speak out. You see, many times, we're told, Paul tells us, as a matter of fact, in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, but our enemies are not flesh and blood, they're not human, but we fight against principalities and the powers of this world. And we know this is true. But you see, this is not always the case. Matter of fact, most of the time, we're fighting against ideologies. We're fighting against philosophies. We're fighting against culture itself. Sometimes we're even fighting against general practices. Sometimes the enemy is our own hard-headedness, our own stubbornness. Shammah knew who his enemies were. He had discerned that. Didn't have to scratch his head and wonder. He knew who they were, and you and I must do the same. We must discern who our enemies are. Because if we don't, Paul said, I don't want to find myself beating the air. As a matter of fact, he said, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to find myself shadow boxing, not knowing who I'm fighting against. Because that'll get me nowhere, and it'll get you and me nowhere except to defeat. And I know that these can be lonely times. I know these battles can be lonely when you feel as if you're the only one. And sometimes you feel that way, and sometimes you really are that way. The Israeli troops fled, and they left Shammah all by himself. The people ran. They'd been used to running. And so this year was no different. They ran, but Shammah stood alone, stood by himself, and it had to be lonely. But really, when you think about it, you're not alone. God's with you. You and God are a majority. And it's during these times that you and I can be an example to other people. Maybe they will see what we're doing and they'll join the cause. Maybe they'll hear our voice and they'll stand up with us. Maybe they'll see what we're doing, that we'll take the time to go to the school board meeting. We'll take the time to go to the council meeting. We'll take the time to go to the ballot box, and we'll stand up and say, I'm doing this. Will you go with me? And it'll help them to see that there are some things worth fighting for. Some things even worth dying for, if need be. Sometimes worth putting our reputation on the line, if that's what it takes. As we look at these, just a few verses, I want you and I to look at some principles that'll lead to success in these end times. As a matter of fact, they're principles for all times, as we take a brief look at Shammah. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 3 through 8, we see the Israelites. God said, I know that you've wandered around after you came out of the Egyptian bondage. You've wandered around in this wilderness for some 40 years. I've taken care of you. I've seen that your needs were all met. But now you see they had come to Mount Seir, and they had settled down around Mount Seir. And they'd been marching around this mountain. And God looked at them and said, now you've circled this mountain long enough. You've marched around this mountain. You've encompassed, the King James Version says, this mountain long enough. It's time for you to get up and get out of here. It's time for you to go northward. There's some things that you need to do. Have you ever noticed as we're younger, we have a tendency to really be more excited about life? Getting married, high school, college, raising a family, watching that family grow, looking for job promotion, setting goals, having visions, all of these things. And we have a routine, yes, but routines aren't always bad. Sometimes routines help us to become all that we ought to be. Help us to keep our life in order and moving forward. But ruts aren't that way. They're just right the opposite. And the Israelites had gotten themselves into a rut. And sometimes as we get older, as we retire, sometimes we find ourselves in ruts. You know what a rut is? A rut is a grave with both ends kicked out. And we find ourselves in a rut. And we find ourselves marching around the same mountains over and over again because we like the familiar. We don't like to take chances anymore. We don't like to step out. We don't like to stretch ourselves and our thinking. I'm that way. We like to be around the familiar. I don't like to go places where I don't know where I'm at. I have a tendency, I bet you have a tendency, to go back to the same place every year for vacation. Because you're familiar with that place. You know where the restaurants are. You know this place, that place. You're just familiar with that place. I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, maybe it was Gandhi, said, we ought to pick somewhere at least once a year and go somewhere that we've never been. Because you see what happens when we get in a rut as we get older. We like to be around the familiar. We don't like to have new goals. Churches are that way. We don't like to step out. And guess what? Our faith begins to atrophy. Because we've done what we're doing so much and so many times in the familiar until we don't need faith to do what we're doing. We really, whether we verbalize it or not, we say, you know, really, I don't need God to do what I'm doing. And we just settle down and settle in. And sometimes God has to step in and kick us out of our nest or gently give us a little nudge to get us out of the nest and say, okay, I'm going to put you in some areas where you're going to need me. Where you can once again be excited about living. Where you can be excited about setting new goals and seeing new visions and dreaming new dreams. You see, that's what churches needs. You either need to redream the dream that you had or get new dreams. Same way individually. That's why a retiree without any preparation will live about a year and a half. Because they just get in a rut and they don't have anything to do and they get caught up in the familiar and they're just simply comfortable. You see, that's the difference between a leader and a manager. A manager will manage you in your comfort zone. A leader will get you out of your comfort zone. And God says, I'm going to lead you to the promised land. You circled this mountain, and I don't know what your mountain is that you've been circling, but you've circled this mountain long enough. It's time to move forward. Go northward. And one principle of success is this: you must start where you are. Folks, there's some things you can't put off. Some things you can't wait. Look at Shammah. His situation looked hopeless, but he didn't let that stop him. Look at all of those. It's kind of like custard. I think I've shared this with you. Somebody asked, a lady asked this artist, would you draw a picture of what you think Custard must have thought when he saw all those Indians coming against him? And this socialite, the artist drew the picture, and she veiled it, and she was going to have an unveiling, and she invited all of her socialite friends. And at the proper moment, she unveiled that picture and fainted. When she finally came to, the artist said, what in the world's wrong? She said, I want you to draw a picture of what you thought Custer must have thought when he saw all those Indians. The picture that he had drawn was a lot of Indians out in a cotton field picking cotton, and a salmon fish with a halo over it. He said, that's what I think he thought. She said, what do you mean? He said, I think he looked up and saw all those Indians coming at him, and he said, holy mackerel, look at all those cotton-picking Indians. You start where you are. He could have said, I'll wait for a more favorable time. I know surely the odds will improve for me sooner or later. Walt Disney said this, the older man that started Disney World. He said this, if you want to accomplish something, to get something done, he said, then stop talking and start doing. Oftentimes we talk ourselves out of doing the best because we're doing some good things. But folks, sometimes the good is the enemy of the best. We must not allow ourselves to allow the good to keep us from doing the best that God has for us and wants us to do. Shammah took his stand right there in the middle of his pea patch, his pea field, because he was fed up with running. You hear me? He was fed up being afraid. He was fed up living on God's second best and third best. He was tired of giving ground, so he said, enough is enough. I've had it up to here. Now I want to ask you this morning, what is your field? Are you tired of just going around the same old mountain over and over again? Are you tired of not having and knowing any joy in your life? No peace, no prosperity. I don't know what your field is. I can only answer for myself. But whatever it is, it's robbing you of your energy and your peace and your joy of living and the challenges. And you're about ready, and you've settled in and say, there ain't nothing left for me but death and taxes. And you get up every morning, same way, defeated, nothing to look forward to. Oh, but preacher, that's the way it is in old age. Not for everybody. Not for everybody. It doesn't have to be that way. The devil wants you to think it has to be that way. And you can get up and say, oh, my arthritis, I just can't do it today. I don't have any challenges today. Why don't you just say, well, I got some challenges, I got to get up. I think Shammah's battle really, if you get right down to it, I think his battle was over more than just a field of peas, don't you? I think it was more than that. Sometimes we're afraid and we run because we don't see the big picture. We have a tendency to focus on the little things, and little things become so insignificant, or so significant to you and to me. Those things which really aren't that important in light of eternity. Folks, there are some things that aren't worth dying for. There are some things that are worth dying for. Some things that won't amount to a hill of beans in eternity, and most folks don't care. I've seen some preachers lose their ministry over programs and policies and privileges. These may be important, but folks, listen to me, they aren't worth losing a ministry over. Some things in churches, people will fight over lights and carpets and this thing and that thing. You can win a battle and lose the war. What's important is the spiritual growth of the people in the context of the whole church. There is a war that you and I can win if we will focus in on the big picture and quit getting all caught up and allowing our energies to be siphoned off in some tributaries that when it's all said and done will not get us any closer to our goal. Shammah started where he was. That's where you and I must start. And he used what he had. He didn't have the Israelite army to back him up. He didn't even have his people that would back him up. They had already fled. They had run off and left him. He didn't dwell on what he didn't have, though. He focused in on what he did have. And what he had was determination. He had a commitment. He had a belief in himself and a belief in his God. And he said, I'm either going to win or I'm going to go down fighting. If they kill me, they're not going to be able to eat me. I've stood idly by long enough and watched this thing deteriorate. I am going to do something. I'm going to use what I have to see if I can get the job done. Folks, I heard somebody say that I'd rather fail doing something I enjoy than succeed in something that I hate. God told Moses, as a matter of fact, over in Exodus chapter 14. You remember Moses led the people out of Egyptian bondage, and there now in front of them was the Red Sea, and behind them was Pharaoh, and they were hemmed in. As a matter of fact, they were between a rock and a hard place. The people complaining to Moses, Moses, I thought we told you that we wanted to stay back there. At least we had something to eat. And you brought us out here to die. And Moses got on his knees and went to pray. And what would you have done? And God said, Moses, there's a time to pray, and there's a time to get up and do something. You can't do anything until you pray. But when you've prayed, you need to put some feet to your prayer. Moses, get up from there. Use what you have in your hand. Tell the people that they must go forward, and they'll follow you if you'll do that. And he did just that, and God parted the Red Sea, and they went across on dry land, and God killed the Pharaoh and all of his armies. So what he thought was the worst thing in all the world, the two obstacles, God took care of that because he used what he had in his hand. And that's what Shammah did. Go forward. I don't care what the odds are. If God's telling you, go forward. Gideon, the Midianite, they were against Israel. Man, they were fighting against Israel, and God called Gideon to go against him. And Midian said, "Oh, I'm from the smallest tribe. I can't do this. I can't. Look at, I'm so insignificant. I'm a nobody." Well, a nobody became a somebody when God called him. But I've got to have a lot of folks. 32,000. He got them together, mustered the troops. God said, that's too many. And he whittled him down to how many? How many? 300. And God won a great victory. We wait for great resources. We're notorious for doing that individual and as a church. We can't do that. We don't have enough money. Well, you can sit here and die, and what you going to do with your money then? It costs money to send out mail-outs. It costs money to rent a sign. It costs money to do a lot of things, but you can save the money. What you going to do when you don't have any people? Use what you have. That little boy and his lunch. Go get somebody. Go get some food and feed all these people, Jesus said. 5,000 folks plus women and children. Feed these people. Lord, I don't know of anybody here. We don't have any stores close by. I don't know where we'll find it. All I know is a little boy with a lunch with just some loaves and a few fish. So he goes out, the disciple did, and he finds that boy and he brings him back, and he voluntarily, I can't imagine a little boy with a lunch giving his lunch voluntarily, but he does. He gives Jesus that little lunch, and Jesus multiplies it and feeds over 5,000 people. And we sit around, well, we don't have the resources. Put what you have in God's hands. Give it to the Lord. You may not be very significant, you don't think, but I'll tell you, God can use you and multiply what you have to accomplish what he needs to get accomplished. I found out, folks, that if you and I aren't willing to use what we already have, there's no need asking God for something else until we use what we have. Joshua said, you're going to have to make a choice. Told the people going into the promised land, you're going to have to make a choice. You can serve the gods that you served over there in the wilderness in Egypt and all that place, all those places. I don't know what you're going to do, he said, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. And he didn't mealy-mouth around about it. He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. I'd like for you to come with me and serve him, but whether you do or not, I'm going to serve the Lord. Benjamin Franklin, I think it was, who said that those who would give up essential liberties to purchase a little safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Folks, our security is not in our finances, not in our arsenals, not in numbers. Our security is in the Lord. Is in the Lord. And we need to learn that. You may be one voice crying in the wilderness, but keep crying. Keep crying even louder. And if you don't quit, sooner or later, somebody will hear you. You may not get it accomplished all at once. It may take a while. Matter of fact, you may never get it accomplished. Maybe like a little boy out there in the yard at night shooting at the moon. A fella came out and said, "What in the world are you doing?" He said, "I'm shooting at the moon." "Don't you know you'll never hit the moon?" He said, "I'll come closer than you will." And last, you can do what you can. Start where you are. Use what you have. And you can, listen to me, you can do what you can do. You may never get this church turned on. You may never reach your goal. But just for instance in this church, there's some switches that you can reach to turn the church on, and you just may cause others to do the same thing. That may encourage somebody else. Your example is important. Someone has said that to the world you may be one person, but to one person you may be the world. Your example is important. I heard a fellow say one time, he said, I don't believe what you're saying. But he said, I believe that you believe what you're saying. And I think I'll help you. As a man thinks in his heart, so he is. If you think you can't, you can't. If you think you can, you can. Principles of success. Formula for success. Start where you are. Use what you have. Do what you can. Shammah never gave up. He never stopped trying. He never stopped trusting. And he didn't give way to discouragement. He stood right up in the midst of that pea field. I can see it now as those Philistines came swooping down on him. Son, he was ready. Didn't have much, but he was using what he had. Didn't have much. And he said, give me all you got. Because I'm going to tell you this. I have left this pea patch my last time.